Everyone refused to save the paralyzed chief's daughter, but one quiet cowboy decided to save her. Before we dive into the story, don't forget to like the video and tell us in the comments where you're watching from.
The freight wagon came in just past mid-morning, rolling in from the east road with one wheel squealing every time it hit a rut. The three settlers on it looked worn down, faces cracked from sun and wind, clothes stained from travel. They didn't speak to anyone. They didn't slow to greet the blacksmith, the seamstress, or the two cowhands fixing the corral fence. They drove straight around the back of the livery, where things got dumped when no one wanted to take responsibility. Cashin Ward didn't see them at first. He was at the mercantile loading 2 sacks of grain and a tin of lamp oil into the bed of his mule cart. He had a list in his head: get salt, get feed, head back before his mother's cough worsened. She'd been too weak to leave her bed the night before, and he didn't like being away longer than needed. He lived quiet, didn't draw attention, and most folks in town assumed he preferred it that way. But when he walked the cart across the yard to settle a payment, he heard the uneven drag of boots and would behind the livery fence. He glanced over without moving closer. One man got down from the wagon and yanked a rolled wool blanket onto the ground. Another hauled something heavier, arms under what looked like shoulders, body limp below the waist. The third didn't help. He just looked around to see who might protest. No one did. They laid the woman, because it was clearly a woman, on the blanket like unloading freight. She folded sideways at the hips, not under her own strength, just because gravity pulled her. Her legs didn't respond, remained stretched straight and useless. One of the men said something low. Cashin didn't catch the words, only the tone, annoyed and done with her. Then they walked off toward the saloon, like they just dropped off a broken saddle. Cashin stood still, jaw tightening. He didn't step in. Nobody else did either. A stable boy peeked from behind a stall, then kept shoveling. The woman's hair hung down over her chest in tangled black ropes. Her dress was made of deerskin, but torn in several places. A deep rip across the bodice exposed the top of both breasts and her cleavage down the center. The leather was stretched where hands had pulled too hard, and the torn seam ran down along her ribs, showing the bronze line of her side. Dirt stuck to sweat on her chest and collarbone. She was breathing, but slow. Her arms worked, fingers curling into the dirt to push herself up slightly. Her eyes weren't dull. They were alert, dark, and tracking everything. Some people started to talk. One man from the feed store muttered she must have been taken in the raids near Salt Creek. A woman with a flour sack said they'd heard someone captured the daughter of a chief. That made people quieter. If she was important back where she came from, then touching her meant trouble. If she was discarded, then even more reason not to interfere. Cashin finished his loading and kept his distance, but he watched. He didn't like what he saw, and he didn't like that no one else cared. But he had his own burden. His mother, Martha, was nearly blind now, lungs half collapsed from years of damp winters. She depended on him for everything. He'd taken her out to the cabin past the ridge to keep her away from crowded rooms and cold drafts. Some days, she barely ate. He couldn't afford a doctor. He couldn't afford extra mouths or trouble. That was the truth. He left before anyone tried to rope him into conversation. The image of the woman stayed in his head, whether he wanted it there or not. By the time he reached the cabin, his mother was sitting in her rocker with a blanket wrapped around her shoulders. The fire was low. She asked if he remembered the laudanum and the salt. He said yes and set the supplies on the table. She asked if anything happened in town. He said no. He cooked beans and reheated broth. She coughed through most of it, but managed half of her bowl. When she slept, he cleaned the dishes and sat by the door, rubbing the stiffness from his hands. He didn't think of himself as someone who rescued people. He kept to himself. He'd worked cattle since he was 16, saved enough to build a cabin, then everything got spent keeping his mother alive. He wasn't a husband, wasn't a father, wasn't a lawman. His responsibilities were simple. Keep the roof patched, keep her warm, keep the mule fed. But after midnight, the wind carried the sound of coyotes from the south end of town. He knew the distance well enough to imagine the exact spot, behind the livery, where meat scraps and injured animals got left. He saw her again in his mind, lying against that barrel, shoulders exposed, legs still. He tried to reason against himself. She might already be dead, or she might not want help. If he brought her home, he'd be inviting the whole town's judgment and maybe Apache trouble. He was already stretched thin with his mother. His cabin was small. He didn't even have room to put another bed. He sat in the dark long enough for the fire to burn down to coals. His mother wheezed softly in her sleep. When he finally stood, his decision formed without ceremony. Before dawn, the sky still black at the edges, he lit a lantern but kept it dim. He saddled the mule and tied on a folded blanket and a water flask. He didn't bother writing a note. If someone followed, they'd follow. If she was alive, she wouldn't last another day left on the ground. As he rode back toward town, he didn't think of himself as a savior. He thought only that leaving her there would eat at him worse than the consequences of bringing her away. He'd lived long enough to know which regrets stayed with a man. This one would. So he went. The town was quiet, no lamps lit yet. Frost touched the troughs and fence rails. He led the mule around the back of the livery yard, heart thudding harder than seemed reasonable. He wasn't afraid of a fight. He was afraid of failing twice, once by walking away and again by arriving too late. He didn't know her name. He didn't know if she'd even look at him. But when he stepped off the mule and lifted the lantern, he hoped, for the first time in a long time, that he hadn't waited too long. Cashin tied the mule to a fence post before stepping closer. The ground was cold and hard, frost layered over packed dirt. He kept the lantern low so the light wouldn't catch from the street. The wagon yard was empty except for a few chickens roosting under the water trough and a stray dog sniffing at a pile of rags. He didn't hear breathing at first and braced himself for the possibility she'd died in the night. When he came around the feed barrels, she was still there, half on her side, one arm curled under her chest, the other around her waist like she'd been warding something off, even unconscious. The torn deerskin dress had slipped lower across her breasts. The neckline stretched from being dragged. Dirt streaked across the curve of her chest and along the exposed skin at her ribs. Her hair was tangled and matted at the ends, some strands caught under her shoulder. Her lips were dry. Her legs hadn't moved from where they'd been dropped. Cashin crouched and set the lantern at his feet. Her chest moved, barely but steady. Her eyes stayed shut, but he could see dried blood near her hairline and bruises along her upper arm. He checked for rope burns on her wrists. There were faint marks, but they weren't fresh, which meant she'd been bound earlier and then handled roughly. The townsfolk had said she was paralyzed from the waist, but he needed to know for himself. He lifted the hem of the dress slightly at her thigh. There were no fresh breaks or splints, just deep bruising and faint discoloration, signs of an old injury. He touched her calf lightly with 2 fingers. No response. He tested her arm instead, lifting it a few inches and letting it rest back. Her breathing changed a fraction. She wasn't deeply unconscious, just exhausted or weak from dehydration. He reached for the water flask and poured a little into his palm before touching it to her lips. It took a moment, but she swallowed once, slow and uncertain, as if she was waiting for it to turn into pain. Her eyes opened halfway. They didn't widen in fear. They fixed on him with alertness, like she was trying to measure if he meant harm. She didn't flinch. Her breathing quickened, then steadied. Cashin spoke low, steady. "I'm getting you out of here. Don't fight me. I can't drag dead weight quiet." She watched his mouth, understanding tone, if not words. Her fingers twitched once in the dirt, but she didn't resist. He slid his arms under her. One across her back, the other beneath her legs, though they gave no help. Her body was cold where the dress was torn and warm where the skin was covered. She was lighter than he expected around the waist, but solid through the chest and hips. When he lifted, she gripped his coat at the collar, maybe by instinct. The torn neckline of her dress shifted against his shirt, the curve of her breasts pressing briefly against his forearm as he adjusted his hold. He carried her to the mule, and later, as carefully as he could across the folded blanket he'd tied to the pack frame. Her legs stayed limp, so he positioned them to one side and tied them lightly with another cloth to keep them from slipping. The breath she let out wasn't fear. It was relief or pain he couldn't tell. He doused the lantern and tied it back on the saddle ring. Before mounting, he took a last look around. No windows lit, no footsteps, no dogs barking. He climbed up behind the mule and pulled her gently against his chest so she wouldn't fall. Her head rested against his shoulder, hair brushing his jaw. The torn side of her dress gaped where the seam had split along her ribs, and he pulled his coat around her to block the wind. The ride back was slow. The mule didn't like the extra weight, and Cashin kept the animal quiet with a steady hand on the reins. The woman stayed conscious most of the way, breathing unevenly into his coat. Once, he felt her fingers curl into his shirt like she was testing if she could hold on. He didn't speak. Words wouldn't do anything here. His mind turned over what would come next. His mother was sick but still aware. She wouldn't turn this woman away. But the cabin was small, and there was only one cot besides his mother's bed. He'd have to build something low near the stove. He thought of water, clean cloth, food, and how to lift her without reopening bruises. He also thought of the town, the way people looked without acting. If anyone saw him take her, rumors would start before daylight. Some would say he wanted her for himself. Others would call him reckless for bringing Apache blood into his home. A few might warn the sheriff or the traders who crossed paths with native patrols. He considered all of it and didn't change his mind. By the time the first light started to show over the ridge, the cabin came into sight. Smoke from the night's fire drifted from the chimney. Amid his mother hadn't woken and tried to stand on her own. He dismounted and lifted the woman again, her body heavier now that she wasn't bracing at all. She didn't cry out, but sucked in a breath when his arm brushed the exposed skin at her waist where the dress had torn. He pushed the door open with his boot, careful not to knock her head against the frame. Inside, the dim firelight fell across Martha, wore asleep in her rocker, shawl pulled up to her chin. She didn't stir. The cabin was one room, plus a small nook where he kept his tools and gear. He laid the woman on the braided rug near the stove at first, then pulled the extra cot frame from behind a trunk. It was low and sturdy enough. He folded a wool blanket over it and lifted her onto it one careful shift at a time. She watched him with half-lidded eyes, not trusting, not panicked, just watchful. When he pulled his coat off her, she shivered and her hand went to the exposed part of her chest as if to adjust the torn dress. He pulled a spare wool wrap from the shelf and covered her from collarbone to shin. She let her eyes close then, only after. Martha stirred and sensed movement. Her voice was thin and cracked. "Who's that?" Cashin crouched at his mother's side and spoke quietly. They dumped a woman behind a livery. She was still breathing. "I couldn't leave her." Martha blinked her clouded eyes toward the cot. "She hurt. Badly." He glanced over his shoulder. Legs don't move. Bruising everywhere. Dress is all but shredded. Martha didn't ask why or how. She just said, "You give her water?" "Yes." "Then cover her decent and feed her when she wakes." Cashin nodded, the tension in his shoulders easing a fraction. His mother didn't question his choice. She never had when it came to what was right over what was easy. He knelt beside the cot and checked the woman's breathing again. She slept now, shallow but steady. Her hair had fallen across her face, and the neckline of her dress still gaped where the rip had widened. He adjusted the blanket higher so it wouldn't slip while she slept. Only then did he let himself sit back on the floor, back against the stove frame, eyes on both her and the door. His mind ran through what needed fixing: food, water, bandages, something for the pain. And he wondered if she would understand that he hadn't brought her somewhere worse. He also knew town wouldn't stay quiet. Someone would notice by noon that the body behind the yard was gone. Questions would follow. He'd deal with it then. For now, he'd gotten her off the ground and out of Teeth's reach. That was as far as he could think without losing focus. Outside, the sun finally broke over the ridge, turning the frost white instead of gray. Inside, the fire cracked and the room held 3 people. One dying, one saved, and one who hadn't planned on either. By midday, the woman was awake, though she didn't speak. Cashin had given her a tin cup of water and a small piece of cornbread softened in broth. She ate slowly, watching his hands more than his face. She didn't fight him when he lifted her shoulders, so she could drink easier, though the strain showed in the way her jaw tightened. When she shifted under the blanket, he could see the dress still torn beneath it, exposed skin at her side, bruises across her ribs. He made a note to find something sturdier for her to wear once she was strong enough to sit upright. Martha remained in her rocker most of the day. She asked Cashin to describe the woman again, not out of judgment, but to understand who was now sharing their space. He told her what he knew: Apache, young, injured in a way that had taken her legs, left behind like trash. He didn't mention the curve of her body, showing through torn leather, or how light she'd felt in his arms. His mother wouldn't have cared about those things anyway. When Martha dozed, he used the quiet to prepare. He split more wood, emptied the ash pan from the stove, and boiled water in the iron pot. He tore old shirts into strips for bandages and laid them near the hearth to stay warm. He checked the mule and refilled its trough. The routine steadied him. It always had. Inside, the woman followed everything with her eyes. When he came back from outside, she tracked the sound of his boots across the floor. When he set a folded towel beside the cot, she looked at his hands, not the cloth. Her English didn't surface, but she wasn't lost. He could see her mind working. Near late afternoon, he noticed her testing her fingers against the blanket, moving her hands to grip the edge and push herself a few inches up the cot. She stopped when it caused pain across her abdomen. He stood by the table and said evenly, "Don't tear yourself up worse. I'll build a support for your back tomorrow." His tone wasn't soft, but it wasn't harsh either. She glanced at him, understanding enough from the sound to still her arms. He wondered if she had a name she wished she could say, and if anyone had spoken it to her since she was taken. He didn't ask, not yet. Martha woke again around dusk. Her breathing had worsened since morning. Each inhale made a faint rattle in her chest, and the effort of sitting upright seemed to pull what little strength she had left. Cashin helped her to the bed in the back corner, lifting her carefully so she wouldn't cough as hard. She gripped his sleeve while he tucked the quilt over her legs. "You get any rest?" he asked. She gave a small nod. "She's drinking?" "Yes, and eating a little." Martha's hand felt cold when she touched his wrist. "Then she'll live through tonight." He didn't say what he was thinking, that he wasn't sure about his mother. As darkness settled, the wind picked up. The woman lay still, but her eyes stayed open, glancing between the fire and the small back room where Martha now lay. Cashin pulled her blanket higher again when it slipped, making sure the torn leather underneath stayed covered. She didn't resist, but her gaze followed his hand until it retreated. After he stoked the fire and set water to heat again, he sat on the stool near his mother's bed. She was half asleep, breathing shallow through parted lips. He held his palms together and rested them against his mouth, elbows on his knees. He had grown up in this room, then spent years away working cattle in other parts of the territory before returning when his mother's health began to fail. He'd chosen to stay rather than watch her die among strangers in town. He didn't regret it, but the work had worn him into someone who didn't lift his head unless needed. He stayed by her until her breathing evened out into something softer. When he was sure she was asleep again, he went back to the main room. The woman was awake, eyes fixed on the rafters. He didn't speak to her. He set another log on the fire and checked the latch on the door. He thought about the settlers who discarded her and whether they might return to finish what they started if rumors spread that she'd been taken in. He lay down on the floor beside the stove with his coat rolled under his head. The woman watched him for a moment before closing her eyes. The fire cracked. His ears stayed alert even after his eyes shut. Somewhere in the cold hours past midnight, he woke to silence that felt different. Not the usual hush, but a stillness that pressed down. He got up and stepped quietly to the back room. Martha was awake, though barely. Her eyes were half open, pupils clouded. She tried to speak, but only a small rasp came out. He sat beside her on the bed. "I'm here." She blinked slowly. "You did right bringing the girl inside," she murmured, voice thin as paper. "Don't let her think she's a burden." His throat tightened. "I won't." She nodded once, breath shallow. "You always carry more than you say." He didn't answer. There was nothing to say to that. Her chest rose once, twice, then the next breath stalled, snagged, and never fully came back. Her eyes stayed slightly open, fixed on the beam above the bed. Cashin sat there a long time without moving, one hand still on hers. He'd known this was coming, but knowing didn't make the room less hollow. After a while, he reached up and closed her eyes with his thumb. He pulled the quilt up to her shoulders and sat back, staring at the edge of the door frame, because looking directly at her was more than he could take for the moment. In the front room, the woman made a small sound, not a cry, just a shift in breath as if she sensed the change. Cashin didn't go to her right away. He stayed in the doorway, one hand braced on the wall, jaw set tight. His mother was gone. The cabin wasn't the same place anymore, but he wasn't alone in it now. And that meant something had already changed before death came. He didn't sleep again. He sat by the stove until the first gray of morning touched the window, eyes fixed on the flames, mind sorting through what needed to happen next. Not because he was ready, but because there was no other option. Cashin waited until the light outside was strong enough to work by before he moved. The fire in the stove had burned down to coals, and the woman on the cot was awake, though silent. She lay still under the blanket, eyes open, watching the doorway to the back room. She didn't know what had happened during the night, but she could read the air well enough to know something had shifted. He stepped into the small back room alone and closed the door behind him. Martha hadn't moved since her breathing stopped. He stood beside the bed for a long moment, not to mourn out loud. There was no one to hear it, but to make himself face it before the work began. He smoothed the quilt over her chest and folded her hands on top, the way she used to do with his when he was small and sick with fever. The front room stayed quiet. The woman didn't speak, didn't reach for him. She only listened to his footfalls and turned her head slightly when he came back through with a length of muslin and a pair of shears. He didn't explain himself to her. Explanations were for comfort, and he didn't have any to spare. He cut the muslin into 2 strips and wrapped his mother's body with care. Not tight, not like cargo, just enough to keep the quilt from slipping during the carry. He didn't dress her in her best things. She only had 2 dresses left in the chest, both patched and thinning. She told him years ago not to waste good fabric on burial. The ground doesn't see the lace, she'd said once, half joking, half tired. When she was wrapped, he stood still again and let the silence settle. Then he went outside to fetch the spade and a short-handled shovel from the lean-to beside the cabin. The sun had climbed past the ridge, but the dirt was still stiff with morning cold. His breath showed in the air each time he exhaled. He didn't look back at the window. Behind the cabin, just past the split-rail fence, and under a cottonwood that hadn't given leaves in 2 seasons, the ground sloped gently toward the creek bed. He had always assumed this was where it would happen when the time came. The soil there was a mix of sand and loam, not packed with stone like farther up the ridge. He tested the shovel first, pressing his boot onto the iron step until the blade cut through the frost crust. He didn't rush. Each shove of dirt came up slow and controlled, the rhythm steady enough that his mind stayed blank. He dug fence posts, irrigation ditches, and fire pits with the same tools. Digging a grave didn't feel unfamiliar in his muscles, just in the weight of what followed. The wind pushed against his back a few times, stirring dust and dead grass. A hawk circled above the canyon edge, but didn't call. Inside, the woman on the cot watched the empty chair where the old woman had sat the night before. Her thoughts didn't show on her face, but she understood absence. She shifted her hand along the blanket, testing movement in her fingers, pressing down like she was grounding herself. The cabin smelled of smoke and boiled water and something missing. When the grave was near to waist deep, Cashin stopped and rested his forearms on the shovel handle. Sweat had formed along his collar despite the cold. He wiped his forehead with the back of his wrist and kept breathing evenly. He didn't pray. He didn't speak her name. Talking to the dead felt pointless. She had said enough to him while she was alive. He went inside, wiped his boots on the mat, and paused when he saw the woman looking at him. Not curious, not startled, just aware. He nodded once toward the cot, as if to tell her he wasn't finished. She blinked slowly, acknowledging without words that she wouldn't interfere. He went back to the small room and lifted his mother in his arms. She weighed almost nothing now. Her illness had stripped her down over years, until lifting her felt like lifting stacked quilts. He carried her through the main room, careful not to let her wrapped head bump the doorframe. The Apache woman watched, expression unreadable, but her gaze followed until he stepped outside. The ground crunched under his boots as he crossed the yard. He laid Martha down beside the grave for a moment, then climbed in with the spade to clean the corners and flatten the bottom. When he climbed back out, he wiped his hands on his coat, knelt, and lifted her again. He lowered her into the earth without ceremony. The muslin stayed clean only as long as it took to settle her in place. He adjusted the quilt one last time, so her face remained covered. His hand stayed steady. His chest did not. When he looked up, he noticed a woman at the cabin window, half seen through the glass. She wasn't crying. She wasn't turning away either, just watching. He didn't know if her people buried their dead or left them to the land. He didn't know if she thought him wrong for putting someone in the ground without song or fire. But she didn't look away. He picked up the shovel and started filling the grave. Every shovelful sounded like rainless dirt on cloth. He packed the soil down with the flat of the blade and brought more. By the time the earth smoothed level with the grass, his arms were stiff and his palms raw at the calluses. He found a wide, flat stone near the fence and carried it over. He set it upright at the head of the grave, pressing it into the soil until it held. No name carved, no date, but he'd know where she was, and nobody else needed to. He stood there until his breathing steadied and his shoulders stopped shaking from the work. Then he wiped his hands on his trousers and went back inside. The woman lay where he left her. She didn't pretend to sleep or look away. Her eyes tracked him from the door to the stove. He set the shovel by the wall and knelt to stoke the fire. Minutes passed in silence until he spoke, voice rough. "She's buried behind the cabin." The woman's breath caught once in her throat. Not a cry, just a change in rhythm. She looked toward the door and then back at him. Cashin sat on the floor across from her and leaned against the trunk of firewood. He didn't expect her to say anything. He had never expected his mother to last much longer, but expectations did nothing to ease the quiet that followed. He reached for the metal cup still on the table and filled it with water from the kettle. He held it out to her. She pushed herself up with her elbows and took it carefully. Her fingers brushed his hand for a second, firm and warm, with more strength than the night before. She drank half and lowered it to her lap. He watched her for a long moment. "You'll stay here until you can sit up on your own. After that, we'll figure the rest." He didn't know if she understood the words, but she watched his mouth and his eyes, and something in her shoulders eased slightly. Outside, the wind shifted direction, blowing colder from the ridge. The cabin creaked once, as if something had been lifted out of it. Cashin looked at the empty rocking chair by the stove, then at the cot. The house felt wrong without his mother's breathing in it, but he didn't let that show on his face. He stood, wiped his hands on his pants again, and said nothing else. The woman lay back slowly, eyes still open, and for the first time since he'd found her, she didn't look like someone waiting to be discarded again. Inside that cabin, with a grave fresh in the yard and a stranger under his roof, Cashin understood one thing with certainty. Whatever life looked like from this day forward, it would not be the same one he carried yesterday. The cabin felt different the morning after the burial. The silence wasn't the same kind as before. It wasn't just quiet, it was hollow. The chair by the stove sat empty, the quilt folded wrong without the weight of his mother's legs over it. Cashin didn't stare at it long. He moved like a man who couldn't afford to stall, even though nothing in him was ready for the next step. The woman lay awake on the cot, eyes following him as he stoked the stove and added fresh wood. Her breathing was stronger than the day before, though fatigue still dragged at her eyelids. The blanket he'd pulled over her had slipped again in the night. When he bent to lift it back over her chest, he saw how the torn deerskin beneath was barely held together across her ribs. The neckline still gaped low, the rip at her side showing the shape of her waist and the soft curve at her hip. There was no way she could keep wearing it without freezing or exposing herself every time she moved. He straightened and looked toward the trunk against the wall, the one holding the last of his mother's things. He stood there a long moment before opening it. The lid creaked. Inside were folded garments she hadn't touched in months. 2 worn dresses, one faded blue calico, the other a brown wool with a torn hem she'd meant to mend. He pulled the wool dress out first and checked the front. The neckline was higher and the sleeves long enough to cover bruises. It wasn't beautiful, and it wasn't size for the woman's build exactly, but it was better than the shredded hide clinging to her body. He didn't announce his intention. He carried the dress to the table, set it down, and then filled the kettle with water. She watched him, eyes narrowing slightly, studying every move. She didn't seem frightened, just ready to bolt with her arms if she still had legs to run. He crouched near the cot, not too close. His voice stayed even. "Your clothes won't hold another day. I'm not leaving you in them. This will cover you." She followed his gaze to the wool dress, then back to him. She didn't answer, her English either missing or locked behind silence. But her jaw flexed once, like she was weighing offense against practicality. He continued, slow and clear. I'll help you change. I'll keep the blanket over you. I won't touch what I don't need to. She held his eyes longer than before. No fear there, just calculation. After a beat, she gave his smallest nod. He didn't make a show of it. He pulled the blanket higher over her chest, then reached beneath to find the seams of the ruined dress. The leather ties down the side were snapped, the bodice split where someone had torn at her. Her skin was marked with hand-shaped bruises and faint scars near her thigh, a history no one bothered to ask her about before abandoning her. He cut the remaining ties with his pocket knife, slow so the blade wouldn't nick her. When he peeled the leather down from her shoulder, she tensed once, gripping the edge of the cot with her fingers. He paused, gave her a second to steady her breath, then lowered the torn garment in pieces, keeping the blanket over her the entire time. He didn't look at what wasn't necessary to see. He'd seen enough of what other men had already taken. When the old dress was ready, he slid his arms around her back and lifted her enough to pull the wool over her head. She helped with her left arm, threading it through the sleeve, though her right arm moved slower. The fabric hung loose around her waist, but covered everything the leather hadn't. She sank back, breathing harder from the effort. He adjusted the blanket over her again. The ruined hide lay in strips on the floor. He gathered the pieces and set them aside by the hearth. She watched him do it, something unreadable in her stare. It wasn't until then that he noticed something he'd ignored before, the faint tremor in her thigh when she'd braced herself for his touch. Not a full response, just a flicker. He didn't comment on it, but he stored away. He made coffee and porridge, the same plain meal he'd made for his mother when her stomach was weak. When he offered the bowl to the woman, she hesitated at first, then took it and ate with her hands steady. He watched the way she held the spoon, not timid, not wild, just controlled. His mind turned to the next problem, what to call her. He couldn't keep thinking of her as the woman forever. After a long silence, he asked, "You have a name you speak?" She didn't answer right away. Her eyes narrowed, as if deciding whether to give anything to a man she didn't choose. Finally, she touched her chest with 2 fingers and said, quiet but certain, "Sahel." He repeated it without decoration. "Sahel." She held his gaze as if measuring how he said it, not mocking, not twisting the sound. The name stayed between them, solid now. He didn't offer his own. Not yet. Names created weight, and there was already enough of that in the room. Outside, the wind picked up again, blowing colder from the ridge. He had work waiting, tools to mend, animals to feed, a grave still fresh in the yard that thieves or wolves could disturb if he didn't mark it proper. But he didn't leave her yet. Instead, he stood near the stove and said the next thing that needed saying. "They'll be talking town sooner than I like. Your being here won't stay quiet long, but you're not going back there. And no one's coming through that door without getting past me." She didn't smile. She wasn't the kind. But something in her eyes shifted, softer at the edges, as if she recognized a promise when she heard one. When he finally stepped outside to tend the mule and chop more wood, she lay back on the cot and pulled the blanket closer to her neck. The wool dress covered her bruises now, and though the fabric didn't belong to her, it held better than the leather someone tore off in anger. The cabin still carried the absence of the dead, but also carried something else now. 2 people forced into the same shelter, neither owing the other gratitude or explanation, but tied to the same roof by circumstance and choice. And for the first time since he carried her from the livery yard, Cashin realized he didn't feel like he'd brought trouble home. He felt like he'd prevented something worse from happening, to her, and maybe to himself. The day would bring questions, work, danger, and the kind of attention he'd spent years avoiding. But morning had come, and she was alive in his home, dressed, covered, watching the door with a mind still sharp. That was enough to start with. By the time the sun cleared the ridge and poured light across the yard, Cashin was already outside splitting wood. Each strike of the axe was steady and controlled, not rushed. The ground was still frozen near the edges of the grave, where fresh soil sat darker than the rest of the yard. He didn't look at it while he worked, but he could feel its presence behind him like another set of eyes. Inside the cabin, Sahel pushed herself upright with her arms. The wool dress he'd put on her hung loose around the waist but held across her chest and shoulders. It covered the bruises where the leather dress had gaped, though the fabric rubbed her ribs where the healing was still tender. She shifted slowly, feeling the weight of her legs like dead branches tied to her body. No sensation below the hips, nothing new there. But her arms were strong, and she tested them against the cot frame, pulling herself up higher until she could lean back against the wall. She scanned the room with quiet calculation. The bed where the old woman died was empty now, the blanket folded and placed on the trunk. Near the stove sat the chair that had creaked under the weight of a body that no longer filled it. Sahel watched the dust motes drift through the light leaking from a single window and listened to Cashin's axe in measured rhythm. Nothing about his movements outside told her she was in danger, but danger rarely announced itself. He came in when the woodpile was high enough for 2 days. He shook the cold off his coat and glanced her way without speaking. She was sitting higher on the cot this time, and his eyes caught the strain in her arms and shoulders from getting there. He nodded once, not praise, just acknowledgement, then went to the stove and added more water to the kettle. The room's silence didn't bother him, but it pressed differently now. With his mother gone, every sound had room to echo. He pulled a chair near the cot and set a folded bath cloth and a basin of warm water on the floor. "You need washing," he said flat, as if stating the weather. "You've got dirt and dry blood on your back and arms. Infection will set in if it's not cleaned." She studied his posture. He didn't move closer without waiting for her reaction. She looked at the basin, then at the closed door to the back room, then back at him. He didn't reach for her. He let her decide. After a long moment, she shifted her arms forward and gave a small nod. Not submission, permission. He pulled the blanket down from her shoulders just enough to uncover her back and arms. His hands moved with the caution of someone who had learned to avoid causing harm by accident. He dipped the cloth in warm water and wrung it out over the basin. When the first pass of water touched her skin, she inhaled sharply but held still. He cleaned slowly, wiping away the dirt along her shoulder blades, careful not to pull at bruises. He said nothing about the scars he found near her spine, thin, pale lines that came from bindings or impact. When he reached the base of her neck and down between her shoulder blades, she braced one hand on the cot and kept her eyes shut. The contact was gentle but foreign. He didn't linger and didn't turn her toward him, keeping his focus strictly where it needed to be. When he finished her back and arms, he stepped away and spoke evenly. "I'll heat more water tonight. You can wash the rest when you're ready." He didn't mention that she couldn't kneel or squat over a basin. He was already thinking about how to build something for her to sit against near the stove. She watched him as he gathered the basin and cloth. She noticed his face, the lines at the corners of his eyes, the slight hollowing that came from losing sleep. She also noticed he had not once removed the blanket entirely from her body, even when practicality could have given him an excuse. That told her more than any promise could. He poured the dirty water outside and came back in with fresh kindling. As he passed the cot, she asked her first question in English, the words shaped carefully. "You bury her here?" He didn't look surprised that she spoke. "Yes." She pointed with 2 fingers toward the back of the cabin. "There." "Behind the cottonwood," he said. "Ground softer that side." She looked down at her lap and pressed her hands together. "You dig alone?" "Yes." No more was said, but the answer filled the room in a way neither could avoid. Around midday, he set a plate of beans and flatbread in her lap. She ate steady, not rushed. When she finished, he took the empty plate and finally said, "Cashin." She looked at him with a sharpness born of readiness. He pointed his own chest. "Cashin, that's my name." She blinked once, absorbing it. Then she rested her hand over her sternum. "Sahel." "I remember," he said. He didn't offer his hand. She didn't offer hers. By late afternoon, he set to building a bench backed with a plank so she could sit upright near the fire without leaning against the wall. He cut the wood outside, planing it enough so it wouldn't splinter through cloth. She listened to the hammer tapping and the saw cutting, measuring the sound of him working for her needs. Inside, she eased herself inch by inch into a straighter seat on the cot, testing her balance without the blanket sliding. Pain sparked in her lower back when she moved wrong, but she bit it down and adjusted her arm placement. Every piece of movement was a plan, not an impulse. Cashin carried the bench inside and set it near the stove. He looked at Sahel, then at the bench. "You gonna sit up proper? I'll move you after I check your legs." Her eyes narrowed slightly, not in fear, but in calculation. He knelt by the cot and pressed 2 fingers just above her knee. No response. He pressed lower, then higher on the thigh. A twitch, faint, involuntary. She noticed his pause. "Feel nothing," she said quietly. "You twitched," he answered. She didn't look hopeful. "Pain, no. Touch, no. Muscle only." He nodded once. "Means there's still something working inside. Can't say what it'll amount to, but it's not nothing." She didn't thank him. She simply held his gaze like that information mattered more than food. He slid one arm behind her shoulders and the other under her knees, lifting her slow onto the bench so she could lean against the plank. She gripped his arm once as he moved her, not to hold him back, but to brace herself. When he set her down, her back straightened and her breathing eased. It was the first time since he'd brought her inside that she'd been upright without lying on her side. She sat still, arms folded in her lap. He adjusted the blanket over her legs and stepped back. He didn't look at the grave through the window. He didn't look at the empty corner where his mother's bed had been. He looked at the living person in front of him, who was now dressed, propped, fed, and still breathing because he had chosen not to walk away. Before sunset, he stepped outside to check the fence and the mule. While he was gone, Sahel traced the grooves in the bench with her fingers, learning its shape. Where her hand slipped to her thigh, she pushed down firmly with her palm. No feeling, but she kept pressing anyway, as if mapping the body she could no longer command. Cashin returned with a small sack of nails and an old sheepskin. He laid the sheepskin across the bench so the wood wouldn't rub her back raw. She didn't thank him for that either, but she shifted against it, testing, and didn't look away. Night fell. The wind changed again. He lit one lantern and closed the shutters. She stayed upright until her arms trembled from holding her posture. When she finally slumped forward, he carried her back to the cot without comment. She lay on her side, facing the stove. As he covered her legs, she spoke once more, voice low and certain. "Town come?" He didn't lie. "Yes. Someone will ask questions soon." "What do you say?" "That you're not theirs to touch, and you're not leaving with them." She considered that, then turned her head slightly on the makeshift pillow. "You fight for me?" He met her eyes. "I already have." She didn't smile, but her breathing changed, steady, calmer, less guarded. Cashin sat by the stove until the fire settled. He didn't look toward the closed door of the back room. He looked ahead, past grief and trouble, at the work that hadn't ended just because one grave got filled. And in that same room, with the dead behind the cabin and the living watching the flames, two people who didn't owe each other anything began the slow, quiet work of becoming something harder to break. By the second morning after the burial, the wind had dropped, but the air held a dull, warning kind of stillness. Cashin was up before full light, moving quiet around the cabin, checking the stove, filling the kettle, and packing dried beans into a pot so they could cook down by afternoon. Sahel was awake on the cot, already pushing herself up with her arms before he said anything. He slid the bench closer to the fire and lifted her onto it with practiced ease, no hesitation. Each day, he handled her with the same blunt care, never gentle in voice, but never careless in touch. She sat upright with her back against the plank and the sheepskin cushion he'd laid there for her, hands resting in her lap as she watched him stoke the flame. Her hair hung loose down her back, and though the wool dress was still too big at the waist, she'd learned how to fold it under the blanket so it stayed in place. There was no shame in how she carried herself. Whatever had been done to her before he found her hadn't stripped that from her. When the fire was settled, Cashin stepped outside to check the mule and the fence near the cottonwood. He glanced once at the grave, fresh dirt darker than the rest of the yard, the flat stone marking the head. He didn't linger there. Work didn't pause for the dead, and every hour he spent outside was another hour she sat alone inside with only silence and heat for company. He hauled a bucket of water from the creek, boots leaving a hard path across the dirt. As he neared the cabin again, he noticed something off, tracks near the edge of the yard. Not his, not hers. 2 sets of boot prints, faint but newer than last night. Someone had come near enough to see the grave or the smoke and walked off before he woke. He set the bucket down outside the door and looked back along the prints, following them a few steps toward the road that wound faintly toward town. They faded into older hoof marks and cart ruts. He didn't like that they came close to the tree line and then turned back. Someone had been watching, deciding something, and left before making themselves known. Inside, Sahel heard the door open and close. She could tell from the pace of his steps that something outside had shifted his attention. He set the bucket by the stove and didn't immediately start talking or working. She watched him peel off his gloves and hang them near the fire. "You hear anything?" he asked, not looking at her yet. She shook her head once. No sound but wind. He nodded. "Tracks out by the ridge path." Someone came close. She didn't tense, but she shifted her arms, grounding herself on the bench. For her. She meant Martha. Maybe. Or for you. He didn't soften it. She didn't show fear, but her eyes darkened. "They come here, you send them away?" "I don't send. I turn them back," he said plainly. Her gaze stayed on him, searching his face to see if that was something a man said for comfort or because he stood by it. She must have found her answer, because she looked away and adjusted the blanket across her legs. He spent the next hour in the lean-to sharpening an axe and sorting tools. Through the window, Sahel could hear the rasp of metal and the thunk of wood being shifted. She traced the bench's edge with her thumb and studied the pattern in the floorboards and the door hinges, memorizing the ways out and what sounds belonged to him. Noon neared before he noticed movement on the road. A single rider, horse moving at a steady, unhurried pace. Cashin stepped to the window and squinted against the light. The man wore a brown coat, hat pulled low, rifle sheathed at his saddle. Sheriff Alden. Cashin recognized the horse more than the man. Sorrel with a white blaze down the nose, same one always tied up outside the saloon on supply days. Cashin didn't swear or reach for his gun. He just rolled his shoulders once and stepped outside before the sheriff could dismount. Alden reined in at the fence but stayed seated, glancing at the grave and then at the cabin door. "Heard about your ma," he said. "Figured I'd check if you needed a word spoke over her or marker set." "She's buried," Cashin said. "Stone's set. No preacher needed." Alden nodded, not offended. "You do it alone?" "Yes." The sheriff looked toward the cabin again. "And the Apache woman?" "Folks in town are saying she's gone. Woke up yesterday and no one could find her body. You know anything about that?" Cashin didn't flinch. "I know I found a woman left like trash behind the livery. I know I brought her out before coyotes did worse than men already had." Alden exhaled, slow, through his nose. "You bring her here, Cass." "She's here. You planning to turn her over to any tribal riders if they come asking? Or keeping her hid?" Cashin's jaw worked once. "She's not property to trade or return." Alden studied him. "Town's stirring. Some think you're holding trouble. Some think maybe you saved yourself a woman when no one was looking." Cashin took a step closer to the horse. "Any man comes up here thinking they can walk himself back down with whatever's left of his teeth." Alden didn't challenge that. He shifted in the saddle. "I'm not here to drag her out or haul you off. I'm here so you know eyes are on you now. If the men who left her come back and find her gone, they'll raise hell, and hell tends to leak past property lines." Cashin nodded. "They won't take her back, dead or alive." Silence sat between them a moment. Then Alden said, "You need anything for her? Cloth, medicine?" "I'm not blind to what was done to her." Cashin didn't answer right away. Asking for help meant debts or questions. But he wasn't about to let Sahel lie in fever if infection set in. "Clean bandages," he said. "Cooking salt. That's all." Alden gave a short nod. "I'll send it with the stage driver. But if riders come asking for blood over her, I can't promise I'll get there before they do." Cashin stepped back. "I won't be waiting on you." The sheriff tugged the reins and turned the horse. He didn't look back as he rode off. Cashin watched until the rider disappeared past the stand of pines, then finally re-entered the cabin. Sahel looked at him, reading his face before he spoke. "Townsend man?" she asked. "Sheriff," he said. "He knows you're here." She absorbed that. "He take me?" "No." She studied him a second longer. "He come back?" "Maybe. Others too." She nodded once, not with fear but acknowledgement. Cashin crouched by the stove, stirring the beans so they wouldn't burn. "You need a better place to sit. Bench won't do forever. I'll build something with arms you can lean on." She didn't argue. Her eyes moved to the door, then to the back room that now held no one. After a moment, she asked quietly, "Your name, I say, right?" "Cashin." You said it right. She took that in, then asked a second question without ceremony. You tell them I stay? Yes. What they do then? They decide if they got the nerve to come ask me to give you up. She held his eyes a long time. There was no fear in her expression now, just the measured understanding of someone who had already been through worse than threats. He set two bowls on the table and helped her back onto the cot so she could eat with her back supported. As she ate, he went to the trunk and quietly removed the last of his mother's clothing to pack away in a burlap sack. The cabin didn't have space for ghosts to cling to the edges of every surface. He folded the dresses, the shawl, and the worn wool socks and tied the sack shut. When he lifted it, Sahel watched without speaking, sensing this was not something he wanted witnessed, but something that had to be done. He carried the sack to the lean-to without a word and stowed it high, out of sight. When he came back inside, she said one thing. You fight before. Not new. He looked at her. You're not the first thing I've had to stand for. She nodded, accepting the answer without needing the story. The rest of the day passed in quiet labor. He shaped wood for a chair with low sides, something she could be lifted into without sliding. She watched him work, following the way his hands steadied each board before he struck a nail. By sundown, the chair frame sat near the hearth. She was back on the bench, arms folded over the blanket. He brought a second blanket and draped it over her shoulders. She didn't move away from it. Outside, the air was still. No riders, no voices. Just the dirt, the grave, and the two of them in a house that held the dead yesterday, and something unspoken now. Neither asked the other what came next. But the knock on the door hadn't come yet, and both of them knew it would. The sheriff's visit didn't stay quiet in town. News traveled the way it always did. Half truth, half fear. By the next morning, Cashin could feel it in the air before he saw anyone. Even the mule was uneasy, ears shifting toward the ridge when the wind carried the faint creak of leather and metal. Sahel felt it too. She didn't ask, she didn't need to. She'd lived long enough around men to know when another kind of danger was on the way. Cashin had moved her from the cot to the new chair he'd built near the stove, low enough where she could rest her arms on the sides without tipping. The wool dress hung better on her now that she sat upright. She'd tied part of the loose fabric at her waist with a strip of cut cloth, and though her legs stayed lifeless beneath the blanket, her posture carried the same pride she'd had even when dumped in the dirt behind the livery. Cashin checked the windows before stepping outside. The sky was pale and cold, thin clouds streaking east. Tracks from the sheriff's horse still marked the road, but fresh ones crossed over them. Two riders, maybe three, from the size of the prints and the way the hooves had dug harder on the turn. He didn't rush. He carried a pail to the creek, filled it, then checked the hen house and the latch on the lean-to. When he came back through the yard, he stopped near the grave. The soil had settled some overnight. He pressed his boot along one edge to level it. He wasn't thinking about prayer, just about keeping the ground sealed if someone came nosing around. By mid-morning, hooves sounded on the road, slow, then stopping. Not at the door, at the edge of the yard. Cashin came out before they could dismount. 3 men, 2 he knew by trouble, 1 by cowardice. The first, Connor Hale, a ranch hand who worked south of town and drank more than he labored. The second, Blaine Cutter, brother of one of the settlers who'd hauled Sahel in during the raid months back. The third was Jeb Rowland, who'd kept quiet while others talked but always followed wherever noise led. None of them wore badges. None had the posture of men asking permission. Cashin stood halfway between them and the cabin door. He didn't rest his hand on his pistol, but he didn't leave it far from his side either. Connor Hale spat into the dirt first. Word says you picked up something that wasn't yours to keep. Cashin didn't blink. Then words talking too much. Blaine Cutter leaned forward in his saddle, face thin and sour. My brother had claim on that Apache. She was taken in a raid fair, and if she went lame after, that don't make her yours. Cashin answered flat. Your brother left her for animals to tear apart. That's not a claim. That's disposal. Jeb Rowland shifted, but didn't speak. Connor looked past Cashin at the gravestone. Town says you buried the old woman. Shame, but maybe now you got space for something warm in her place. Cashin stepped closer, voice low but carrying. Say her name again in the same breath as that, and I'll put you in the ground next to her. That stalled all 3 for a second. Blaine straightened his shoulders. We ain't here to fight you, Ward. We're here to take back what belongs to us. The law don't stand with natives. You know that. Cashin's jaw flexed once. I don't need law to keep you off my land. Inside the cabin, Sahel heard every word. She didn't shift. She didn't call out. She only watched the door and measured the silence between voices. Her hands rested on the arms of the chair, fingers relaxed, but ready to brace if he brought someone in hurt. Outside, Connor dismounted first, boots crunching over the hard dirt. You can hand her over easy, or we can walk in and take her. Either way, she ain't staying here. Cashin didn't move back. His tone didn't rise. You walk toward that door, and you won't make it halfway. Blaine Cutter slid off his horse too, hand near the knife on his belt. You think the sheriff's gonna side with you when town starts yelling, you keeping an Apache woman for yourself? Folks already saying you gone strange since your ma passed. Cashin's eyes narrowed. Sheriff won't get here fast enough to help you. Jeb Roland hesitated in the saddle, glancing at the cabin window as if expecting eyes behind it. None showed. Cashin let the silence stretch until it felt heavy. Then he took one step closer to Blaine. You touch anything I brought out of that yard, and I'll take your hand off at the wrist. You understand me. Blaine sneered, but his boots didn't move. Connor looked at the grave again. Dead mother, half a cabin, and a crippled woman who don't speak your tongue. You're gonna get yourself killed over something that ain't even whole. Cashin didn't raise his voice. She's more whole than any of you. That landed like a thrown rock. Jeb dismounted then, not out of courage, but because he didn't want to be the one still sitting if a shot got fired. Cashin didn't wait for them to think they had ground. You got till the count of 3 to turn around. Blaine's lip curled. Or what? 1, Cashin said. No shout. No gesture. 2. Jeb stepped back first, hand off his pistol. 3. Blaine opened his mouth, something nasty ready to come out, but Connor caught his arm. Not here, he muttered. Not with him set like that. Cashin didn't smile, didn't warn twice. He stood still as they backed up to their horses and mounted again. Before turning, Blaine called out, "You'll regret this when the rest come asking." Cashin answered, "Bring them." They rode off without looking back, dust kicking up behind the hooves. Cashin watched until the road swallowed them. Inside, Sahel didn't ask what was said. He entered the cabin and shut the door with a solid push, not a slam. His pulse had steadied by the time he crossed to the stove. She studied his face for signs of blood, bruises, or breaks. There were none. "They come," she said. "They left. They come again." Yes. She absorbed that like she would a change of season. You kill if they try. If they step through that door, yes. She watched him remove his coat and hang it by the wall. The tension in the room didn't leave, but it settled into something both of them recognized, shared ground in a land that didn't grant much of it. He poured water into a tin cup and handed it to her. Her fingers brushed his for a moment before she took it. Not accidental, just unafraid. He sat on the stool near the fire. "Tomorrow I'll bring in more water and reinforce the back door. Anyone tries to circle around, they won't make it far." She didn't thank him. She didn't need to. Minutes passed in quiet. The crackle of the fire filled the space where fear could have lived. She broke the silence first, not with a question, but with a plain truth. "They leave me before. Men, one by one. You don't leave." He met her eyes. "No." "And you don't sell." "No." She nodded once. "Then I stay. Not as possession. Not as pity. Not as debt." He didn't speak again, but something in his posture changed, slight but real. Outside, boot tracks led away from the cabin. Inside, 2 people who hadn't chosen each other still refused to be parted by those who had. The threat didn't return the next day, or the day after, but Cashin didn't take that as safety. Men who spoke like Connor and Blaine didn't forget insult or challenge, only waited until they could return with more mouths and guns behind them. He reinforced the back door with a bar cut from an old fence beam and nailed shutterboards over the smaller window. He didn't tell Sahel why he moved like a man expecting interruption. She already understood. She strengthened in small ways. Her arms gained steadiness from pulling herself onto the bench and back to the cot each day, never complaining when the effort left her breath short. The wool dress he'd given her stayed neat because she kept it that way, brushing dust from the sleeves every morning, folding the excess fabric across her lap so none of her skin showed by accident. Pride had stayed alive in her even when her legs hadn't. Cashin tested her thighs again on the third evening, pressing 2 fingers into the flesh above the knee. No twitch this time. She watched him do it and didn't look away when she said, "If don't walk, I still work. I sew. I cook. I make what I can make." He nodded. "You do what you're able. I'll do what I'm able." "Not charity," she added. "No," he said. "Not that." He offered his name to her again a few times, and each time she said it cleaner, Cashin, without hesitation. She didn't call him anything else. When he asked again if she wanted something different worn, something he could sew to fit her shape better than the wool, she shook her head once. "This holds. Later, maybe." He didn't push. By the fourth day, the sheriff's promised supplies came: salt, a roll of bandage cloth, and a tin of willow tincture wrapped in burlap and tied to the stage driver's saddle with a note pinned under the string. "That's all I offer. The rest is yours to handle." Cashin burned the note in the stove and stored the items without comment. That afternoon, Sahel asked for a basin of water and the privacy of the backroom curtain so she could wash her own face and arms. He helped her into the room and set the basin on a stool beside the bed that once held his mother. She braced herself with one arm and washed without spilling, jaw tight against the pain of bending. When he lifted the basin away later, she said only, "Next time, I do more." He didn't argue. He let the statement stand. The men who'd come to threaten them didn't reappear before the ground froze deeper, and Cashin suspected the sheriff had spoken to someone, not to defend him, but to warn that shooting would bring more trouble than reward. It didn't remove danger, but it pushed it back until it was farther down the road. One night, when the fire burned low and the air in the cabin carried the cold that always found its way through winter chinks, Sahel spoke without prompting. "My father is chief for people southeast of here. They think I'm dead." Cashin didn't respond at once. He sat across from her, whittling a strip of pine for kindling. "He come for you if he hears otherwise." She held his eyes. "If he comes and finds me chained, he burns this place and every place near. If he comes and finds me safe," she didn't finish the sentence. Cashin set the pine down. "If he comes, he'll find you safe and not kept. You not own me," she said, not questioning, but stating what she needed clear. "I know," he answered. She studied him another long moment. "Men who took me, they say I only worth something if I give them what they want. You don't ask. I didn't bring you here for that. So why?" He met her eyes. "Because I couldn't walk away again." For a moment, neither spoke. Then she reached down and adjusted the blanket, so her legs were fully covered, as if sealing something closed around them. Not shame, acknowledgement of what was hers to keep guarded. As nights passed, they fell into a rhythm that didn't need explanation. He carried water, chopped wood, set traps near the creek. She sorted dried corn and cut cloth for mending. When he set a shelf lower on the wall, so she could reach the cups without straining, she didn't comment, but her hand rested on it a second longer than needed when she first used it. 3 weeks after the sheriff's visit, Cashin rode into town for supplies. He didn't tell Sahel how long he'd be gone. He only said, "I'll be back before dark, and the door stays barred unless you know the voice." She nodded and watched him leave, the mule trailing behind. In town, eyes followed him. Some men looked ready to spit words at him, but none stepped into his path. The sheriff saw him tie off the mule and didn't walk over. That was as good as protection got. Cashin bought flour, lard, spare nails, and coarse cloth. As he passed the saloon porch, Blaine Cutter leaned against the post with a bottle in hand and muttered something low enough not to be heard clear. Cashin kept walking. If they meant to act, they'd do it away from witnesses. He returned before sundown. Sahel had pulled herself halfway onto the bench near the window, using the chair arm and the cot frame to leverage her body. He lifted her fully into place without being asked. She looked at the supplies on the table. "You bring needle?" He pulled one from the cloth roll. "2." She adjusted her hands. "I fix your shirts. And maybe my dress. When pain low." "Good." The next morning, he helped her outside for the first time. He built a low platform from planks and set it near the back of the cabin where the wind couldn't cut. He carried her out in his arms and sat her on the platform with blankets under and behind her. Her eyes swept the open land, the cottonwood, the grave, the ridge line, the creek path. Not as prisoner, but as someone mapping what she still claimed as hers to look at. She placed a hand on the earth beside her and pressed down. "Cold," she said. It'll frost hard soon, he answered. She looked at the grave. She sleep there? Yes. You come there. Every day. She was silent a moment. I don't leave you. Not until I walk or until you tell me go. He didn't look at her when he said, I won't tell you to go. And for the first time since he'd carried her from the dirt behind the livery, she let the air out of her lungs in something close to ease. Not surrender, not joy, but the release of a breath held too long. Evening settled over the ridge, and Cashin carried her back inside. The firelight marked their shadows across the floor, his tall and solid, hers seated and unmoving below the waist, but not small. The cabin no longer felt like a place holding a stranger. It felt like two lives that had refused a break, sitting through the winter side by side. Whatever came next, men, tribe, or storm, would find them in the same room, under the same roof, not because either had asked for it, but because neither had walked away when left the choice. And in a land where most things were taken, that was more than survival. It was theirs,